Oxford University's 800-year history had never known such silence as when Professor Edmund Harrington, a renowned scholar of European history, declared, "Africa has contributed nothing to human civilization." The remark, made during a March lecture on global leadership at the packed Sheldonian Theater, stunned the audience of 500 academics. The event, part of Oxford's African Leadership Series, featured Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, who sat quietly in the front row, dressed modestly and taking notes. Harrington, a celebrated academic with 3 honorary doctorates and 12 books to his name, delivered his lecture with confidence, tracing the roots of civilization to Greece, Rome, Germany, and Britain. The foundations of what we call civilization have decidedly Western origins, he claimed, dismissing other regions' contributions. While some in the audience shifted uncomfortably, Harrington pressed on, stating that Asia had given gunpowder and paper, before uttering the line that would spark global outrage and ultimately end his career. What happened next, when Traoré rose to speak, no one could have predicted. Certainly the Americas had sophisticated calendars. But Africa? Professor Harrington paused, a smirk tugging at his lips. I challenge anyone in this room to name a single significant contribution to human civilization from sub-Saharan Africa. The continent has been a recipient of civilization, not a contributor to it. A stunned silence fell over the Sheldonian Theater. In the front row, President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso slowly closed his notebook and set his pen aside. Around him, African students and scholars sat frozen, torn between outrage and the daunting prestige of the setting. After a tense pause, Traoré raised his hand. "Yes?" Harrington responded, his tone edged with irritation, clearly not expecting to be questioned. Traoré stood calmly and spoke, his voice clear even without a microphone. "Professor Harrington, I would like to respond to your assertion, if I may." Harrington's smirk grew as he feigned ignorance. "By all means, Mr. Traoré. Ibrahim Traoré," he answered simply, omitting his title. "And I accept your challenge." A ripple of anticipation stirred the audience as people began recording, sensing a moment of importance. Harrington gestured mockingly to the stage. "Please enlighten us, though do try to stick to historical facts, not romantic nationalism." Traoré walked to the podium, placing a leather folder on the lectern. He stood still, scanning the room before locking eyes with Harrington. "Professor," he began, "before I address your challenge, may I ask you a question? In all your research, have you ever visited the manuscript libraries of Timbuktu, studied the mathematical treatises of the Dune people, examined the metallurgical innovations of the Haya people of Tanzania?" Harrington waved a hand dismissively, but the weight of Traoré's words had already shifted the air in the room. "Ancient mud buildings and primitive folklore hardly constitute civilization, Mr. Traoré. We're discussing contributions to human advancement, not anthropological curiosities," Harrington scoffed, drawing audible gasps from the audience. But Traoré remained composed, opening his folder and holding up a document. "Then let us begin with something you might recognize," he said calmly, displaying a photocopy. "This is a page from the Lubombo bone, discovered in Swaziland, 44,000 years old. It contains the earliest known mathematical calculations in human history, 29 notches marking lunar cycles. Mathematics didn't begin in Greece, Professor. It began in Africa." Harrington's smirk faltered, but he attempted to dismiss the evidence. Counting notches is hardly Pythagoras. Unfazed, Traoré produced another document. "Then perhaps the Ashango bone from the Democratic Republic of Congo, 20,000 years old, will interest you. It shows evidence of prime numbers, multiplication, and division. That predates Greek mathematics by nearly 19,000 years." He paused, letting the weight of the facts settle over the silent room. "You want more recent examples? Very well. The University of Sankore in Timbuktu housed 700,000 manuscripts and educated 25,000 students in the 12th century, when Oxford was still a cluster of drinking halls." The audience leaned in as Traoré's voice grew stronger, never losing its steady grace. "You cite Roman law? The Ashanti Confederacy had a constitution with checks and balances 3 centuries before the U.S. Constitution. The Buganda Parliament featured complex democratic governance, while Europe remained under absolute monarchs. You speak of German philosophy? Have you studied Zara Jacob, the 17th century Ethiopian thinker who developed ideas of rational inquiry and human rights before the European Enlightenment? His student, Walda Haywat, authored ethical treatises rivaling anything written in Europe. Though, granted, they wrote in Ge'ez, not Latin, so perhaps they don't qualify in your view. Harrington tried to interrupt, but Traoré raised a hand and the professor fell silent. Isolated, Professor? Let me tell you about isolation. The Library of Alexandria, founded by an African dynasty, preserved global knowledge while the ancestors of Oxford's founders still lived in mud huts. African mathematicians were calculating the Earth's circumference, while Europeans thought it was flat. You want contributions to civilization? Traoré's voice finally rose firm and unyielding. Then let us speak of medicine. The first successful cataract surgery was performed in 14th century Mali. The first cesarean section in which both mother and child survived occurred in Uganda in 1879, using techniques that wouldn't appear in European medicine for another 50 years. And vaccination? Not Edward Jenner's cowpox, but variolation against smallpox was practiced in West Africa and brought to America by enslaved Africans, Traoré said, holding up another paper. Architecture? The great Zimbabwe's acoustic design rivals modern engineering. The Nubian pyramids predate Egypt's. The rock-hewn churches of Lalibela were carved from single volcanic stones with precision that still baffles engineers. But of course, you may not know these things, Professor, because they don't fit your narrative of African primitiveness. The atmosphere in the Sheldonian theater shifted. Students sat upright, taking notes. Professors exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement, others clearly uncomfortable. Harrington's confidence had crumbled into panic, but Traoré pressed on. Metallurgy? The Haya people of Tanzania produced carbon steel in blast furnaces 2,000 years ago, centuries before Europe's Industrial Revolution. The Benin bronzes were so advanced Europeans refused to believe Africans had crafted them, inventing myths about lost Portuguese artisans. Agriculture? Africans domesticated pearl millet, sorghum, African rice, yam, black-eyed peas, watermelon, and okra. They created complex irrigation systems in the Sahel that sustained massive urban populations. While Europe languished in the Dark Ages, the Dune people practiced terraced agriculture that thrives where European methods fail in a season. Traoré then paused, locking eyes with Harrington, who now sat visibly sweating despite the cool air. But perhaps most importantly, Professor, let's speak of Ubuntu, the philosophy that I am because we are. While European thought fixated on individualism and conquest, African philosophy cultivated restorative justice, collective responsibility, and human dignity, concepts the so-called civilized world is only now beginning to grasp. The tragedy, Professor Harrington, Traoré concluded, his voice now soft but piercing, is not that Africa contributed nothing to civilization, it's that so many like you have spent your lives refusing to see it. The tragedy, Traoré said, his voice calm yet cutting, is that scholars like you have spent centuries actively erasing, ignoring, and belittling Africa's contributions to human civilization. He held up a final document. This letter, Professor, is from Cecil Rhodes, yes, the founder of the scholarship that likely funded your education, in which he explicitly calls for the suppression of African history to justify colonization. Your ignorance is not accidental. It's the product of a deliberate, systematic effort to erase Africa from the story of civilization, and you've been perpetuating that for 47 years. The theater was silent. Harrington stood speechless, but Traoré continued. I could speak of the Dogon people, who tracked Sirius B before Western telescopes existed, of African fractal geometry predating Mandelbrot, or of how African musical traditions gave birth to jazz, blues, and rock. But I think the real question, Professor, is not whether Africa contributed to civilization. It's why you, a professor at Oxford, don't know any of this, or worse, why you do know and choose to deny it. The first clap came from a young African woman, followed by another, and soon the entire theater erupted in thunderous applause. Students rose, then professors, and finally administrators. But most striking was Professor Mary Whitfield, head of African Studies, who stood and said into her mic, "Mr. President," finally acknowledging Traor's title, "I apologize. Your words today expose a shameful blind spot in our curriculum. I move that Oxford immediately revise its history programs to include the African contributions you've outlined." The applause intensified. Harrington, standing alone, found no allies. His authority dissolved in under 10 minutes. As Traor gathered his notes, he passed the professor and said, loud enough for all to hear, "I've left you the sources, Professor. I hope you'll read them." By that evening, videos titled, "African President Destroys Racist Oxford Professor" and "The Most Epic Takedown in Academic History" went viral. Within 24 hours, Africa-built civilization was trending worldwide. Harrington announced early retirement, and Oxford issued a formal apology, launching a full review of its history curriculum. A year later, a statue of 16th-century African scholar Ahmed Baba al-Timbuktu was unveiled at Oxford, not Traor, who declined the honor. Its inscription read, "Knowledge has no color, wisdom has no continent, and truth belongs to all humanity." In an interview years later, Traor reflected, "I didn't plan to give that speech, but when Harrington spoke, I thought of the African children who might hear such lies and believe them. I had to speak for those whose brilliance history erased." The tragedy wasn't just one professor's ignorance. It was that his views were accepted at a university meant to seek truth. "That's why I spoke, not to humiliate, but to break the cycle." Asked if he was too harsh, he replied, "When your history has been denied for centuries, truth isn't harsh. It's necessary." Harrington had 47 years to learn. He chose ignorance. I chose not to let that ignorance go unchallenged. The Traor moment is now taught globally as a turning point in academic discourse, a reminder that truth, spoken with dignity and facts, remains the most powerful force against prejudice. And from Lagos to London, from Cairo to Cape Town, students now begin their study of African history with one simple truth. Africa is not just part of civilization. It is where civilization began.